to thank everyone for being here today for this luncheon with the World Affairs Council. My name is Rindy Zhang. I'm the Programs Director at the Council. So to my right here, we have Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, who's our speaker tonight. He is an American by choice, not by birth. He grew up in a traditional family in the ancient city of Mazar-i-Sharif in Afghanistan. And as a teenager, speaking only broken English, he spent a year as an exchange student in California, where after some initial culture shocks, he developed a deep affinity for American ideals and a deep conviction that America had a powerful and indispensable role to play in expanding peace, freedom, and prosperity around the world. Ambassador Khalilzad went on to serve as a diplomat under 3 U.S. administrations and is the highest-ranking Muslim to ever serve in the U.S. administration. In the days after 9/11, he found himself uniquely positioned to bring together his two worlds, an America traumatized by terrorism and an Afghanistan that harbored it. As U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan and later to Iraq, Ambassador Khalilzad played a crucial yet largely unknown role in trying to bring stability and security to the greater Middle East while fending off challenges from Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Iran, and other threats to the American security. Ambassador Khalilzad's new book, which I have right here, it's part memoir, part record of a political insider, and also partially incisive analysis of the current situation, dynamics in the Middle East. The book called The Envoy, From Kabul to the White House, My Journey Through a Turbulent World, will be available for purchase and signing after this program. And moving on to our moderator on the far right of the stage, Ambassador Chase Untermeyer. Ambassador Untermeyer has been an international business consultant since he returned in 2007 from Qatar, where he served as U.S. ambassador on appointment of President George W. Bush. And he's a 1968 graduate of Harvard College with honors in government. And Ambassador Untermeyer is currently a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and also serving as chairman of the Texas Ethics Commission. So please join me in welcoming both ambassadors for a conversation on today's turbulent world.
Well, thank you, Rindy, very much. And I thank the World Affairs Council for this singular honor of being able to just be in the same room with Ambassador Khalilzad, but in particular to have the chance to be the one to ask some questions. This, I know, will be a very easy job because Ambassador Khalilzad is so articulate, so knowledgeable, so highly respected for his experience and wisdom that all I have to do is throw out a few words, and I am confident that he will take it from there, as well as make all of us grateful that we are in the same room. Let me say, with regard to this wonderful book that Ambassador Khalilzad has written and which is available here, that this is a marvelous multiple book. It's about an amazing life story. It's about recent world history that we lived through, but perhaps didn't quite appreciate the same way this book tells us. And it's an excellent analysis of what lies ahead. And we hope to tease some of these very things out of Ambassador Khalilzad this morning. What I'd like to begin, just to start off, sir, is to pick up on something Rindy had mentioned, which was that you were an American Field Service exchange student. Many of us who went to public high schools in America knew an AFS student, and which was a very enriching experience for us. But in your case, it really was special. So if you wouldn't mind just expanding a little bit about what that experience was for you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ambassador. You're a great friend for endorsing my book and myself the way you did. Thank you. And thank you to World Affairs Council. And thank you to all of you for spending some time here with me to listen to our conversation. With regard to my journey from Mazar-i-Sharif in Afghanistan to the United States, it was really transformative. I had lived in a city of less than 50,000 in those days in Mazar, in a traditional family, in a city that had great history in terms of its role in that part of the world in medieval times. But like Afghanistan generally, it had become a backwater place because of change in technology, because of trade routes changing, because it used to be along the Silk Road of ancient times, because of invasions and geopolitical changes that affected it, and because of internal decay by the empires of that time that Mazar-i-Sharif or Afghanistan was a part of. It had become, as I was growing up, a very poor, undeveloped or underdeveloped country. We did not have electricity. I remember we had only got our news through a single radio station that was in the capital, Kabul. Life expectancy was quite dismal. Lots of mothers died at childbirth. Lots of children didn't make it to the age of 5. One of the terrible experiences that I had when I was about 11 years old was to see a younger sister of mine die of what seemed like stomach ailment. She had pains, and there was no real doctor even, and we had a pharmacist come and visit. And in retrospect, came to a judgment that what she suffered from was an appendicitis, probably, but there was no such diagnosis made, and she was wailing for days in pain until she passed away. And I could that raised a lot of issues in my mind to asking my parents why one couldn't do something about it. And when she passed away, their answer was must have been the will of God for this to happen. So and I then had come to Kabul, which seemed by comparison the capital in those days, 500,000 people, more developed, more foreign presence. And then within a year and a half, I left Afghanistan to come first to New York and then to go to California, to San Joaquin Valley in Modesto for a year. And you could not imagine two different worlds than the world of Mazar-i-Sharif in those days. We're talking about the 60s. And New York, and in August, I thought, for one thing, on the negative side, that I was going to suffocate because I'd never experienced a combination of heat and humidity that August is New York and maybe Houston, and then to see the high rises, to see the massive numbers of people, to see cars. I didn't mention that we did not have cars in those days. We used to use buggies to travel, and to see the lights and so on, and there is a question in my mind as to why this here and why that there. That's an obvious question. And that made me very interested from almost get-go about what was the secret of America's, what I saw compared to that where I had come from. And as was said, I lived with a family, and my life was never the same, let's put it that way. I could speak for days about this, but I was a changed person after that year, when I went back, I was very anxious to get back here as quickly as possible, and then I came back as a graduate student.
Jumping over many years, many interesting years, how did you enter the George W. Bush administration, particularly at the beginning, to become envoy?
Sure. What had happened was that in the Bush Senior administration, I had been asked to work for the Department of Defense as the head of the policy planning shop in the Department of Defense. I had gotten to know, as a result, the Secretary of Defense of the time, Dick Cheney, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell. And when finally the results of the election became known, as you know, we had a little bit of a problem that the Supreme Court ultimately had to express itself on. I was called by the Vice President-elect if I would go and be the head of the transition team at the Defense Department to take it over on behalf of the incoming administration from the Clinton administration. And so I spent many weeks in the Defense Department as a liaison between the outgoing and the incoming team. And my expectation was that I would stay there in a new role in the Defense Department, but turns out that I was asked to come to the White House to be a special assistant to the president, and I had never met President Bush, George W. Bush, before I was hired to work in the White House, but I had known the Vice President, obviously, and I mentioned, and I had known quite a lot of others, like Condi Rice, and of course, I mentioned Colin Powell would become Secretary of State. So I think they put in a good word on my behalf, and I think the President went along with that.
Much has been said over time about the role that Vice President Cheney had in shaping the Bush administration. Would it be fair to say that he had the guiding hand with regard to Iraq and Afghanistan policy?
I don't know whether I could say that. He obviously was a very influential vice president for many years. And not only he, but his team had an influential role. One of the first orders that the president signed about about how the National Security Council would be organized under his presidency, as to who, besides those who are statutory members of the National Security Council, the president can invite others to join. And he invited some, for example, the National Security Advisor and the Chief of Staff of the Vice President to be a member of the Principals Group and a member of the Deputies Group. These are committees that deliberate on policy options and issues, and the most sensitive, the most critical, then it goes up to from deputies to principals, and from principals to the National Security Council that the president chairs. The vice president and his team played a very important role. But I have not had the experience of other administrations, whether Gore, how much of a role did he have with President Clinton, or how much of a role Joe Biden has had. But there is no question that that for many years, Secretary Cheney and his team had an important role. But he didn't get everything he wanted, I have to say as a corrective. I've heard from Condi Rice, who was the National Security Advisor, that one thought was that the Vice President would chair the principals group. And that was an idea that perhaps was suggested by the Vice President's office, and that the President instead selected that, as is the tradition, that the National Security Advisor would chair the principals, which is the secretaries participate in that, would be chaired by the National Security Council. So he didn't have all the influence, perhaps, that some in his team might have wanted.
Well, then came September 11th, 2001, and perhaps ironically in your life, Afghanistan came full circle, and the decision was made to enter. Could you imagine in that time, in 2001, that the United States would still be involved politically, militarily, economically in Afghanistan in 2016?
Well, first, in 2001, August, I would have never thought that we were going to go and invade Afghanistan, and that I would become the American ambassador ultimately to Afghanistan. There is a lesson to be learned from that the world is very unpredictable, and the most distant place can become quite critical at no time. I mean, I remember the President, the first time I spent some quality time with him was at Camp David that weekend after 9/11, when I was invited to come up to do a tutorial on Afghanistan, and that we have to deal with this country in this location, with these problems, with this history. It was totally unanticipated, and recognition that this is going to be a huge challenge. But no, you're right, I wouldn't have thought in October of 2001 that 15 years later we will still be at war in Afghanistan, and that we would be investing as much resources as we are doing there.
Well, part of...
Which also tells you something about the ability to predict, to anticipate, to calculate accurately, when that's a humbling experience when we talk with great confidence about things. We always have to keep such things into account, that our ability to predict, although we have a huge and very impressive intelligence set of organizations that when it comes to issues of countries, political leaders, tribes, ethnicities, actors who are motivated by a complex set of circumstances, not to mention nation states, that our ability to be precise and confident is limited.
Well, in addition to intelligence, there was also history, which, of course, you knew very well. The slogan was that Afghanistan was the graveyard of empires. A rather grim statement, I think, mostly referring to the British Empire and to the Soviet Union. Right. Has that been the case for the United States? Has the same historical tug to keep us there for at least 15 years been something that history could have warned us about?
Well, we did take the lessons of history into account. I don't think Afghanistan is going to be the graveyard of the United States. Despite the fact that we have made some mistakes in Afghanistan, as in any big enterprise, when you become involved, there are issues in retrospect that you especially that you didn't have a detailed plan and you weren't thinking for a long time and strategizing takeover of the country, and you had within a very short period of time, because of the imperative of what had happened on 9/11 and the demand to do something and to do it rather urgently. But I would say we thought that unlike the Soviets, we would not go in with a heavy footprint, that we would not colonize Afghanistan or rule it ourselves, that we would help the locals form a government very quickly and work with that government. But on the other hand, we did not anticipate properly, and it took us a while to respond, and the complexity of the challenge that we faced with regard to Pakistan, the sanctuaries, to the shock of the Russians and everybody else, our success in overthrowing the regime was lightning. I mean, they thought that, you know, as our press sometimes do it, when we were in the 6th day of the war, people were talking about the Vietnam syndrome, and here we were again, how we were going to get stuck there, never going to succeed. But we, in fact, succeeded very quickly. The government was overthrown, the Taliban dispersed, we killed a lot of Al-Qaeda people, we captured a bunch of them. But then, we confronted this issue of what do you do about Afghanistan? Okay, the president used to remind me that our mission was to bring those who perpetrated 9/11 to justice. He says, Zal, remember, we are there to bring these guys to justice. But then we said we didn't want the country to go back under the control of people like Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And so then you get into the idea of, okay, so what do we do? And I think one of the challenges we faced was that the Taliban dispersed and they went into Pakistan, and we faced the challenge that on the one hand we needed Pakistan's help because a lot of Al-Qaeda people, as we know, bin Laden, went to Pakistan, a neighboring country of Afghanistan, and we were working with the Pakistanis to hunt down as many Al-Qaeda people as possible, and they were helping significantly on that, not totally, but significantly on that. We were also overflying Pakistan to bomb Afghanistan. Remember, this is a landlocked country. It's a huge challenge how to project power in Central Asia to a landlocked country. Only the United States had the power and the capability to do what happened there. I don't think there is any power in history who could have done what we did from so far away. And we were overflying other countries' territory, obviously, and Pakistan being one. And our logistics became dependent on Pakistan because Afghanistan being landlocked, we had to use the Pakistani port once we had people and forces there. And Pakistan also had nuclear weapons, and there was also concern about that. So we, in my view, if there is one single issue that has prolonged our stay in Afghanistan, has complicated our success, increased the cost to us, is the sanctuary issue. Because when an insurgency has a sanctuary, it becomes much harder to deal with. And there are lessons that I talk about in the book as to how we could have done what we should have done to deal with this problem early on. And there is a difference of view among a lot of us who were involved as to could we have done more, how we could have done things differently with regard to that.
It would seem that one of the clear geopolitical results of our interventions in both Afghanistan and later in Iraq has been to remove two problems for Iran, primarily Iraq, which had been a historical barrier for Iranian penetration deeper into the Middle East region. Right or wrong? Did our actions have that effect, and were there policy discussions beforehand that might happen? Warnings were issued that we would be strengthening Iran if we did those things?
Well, factually, of course, it is true that Iran had a problem with the Taliban. They went almost to war with each other. The Taliban being a Sunni Islamist kind of group. And Iran was at war with Saddam Hussein, with Iraq. So, if you want to make a draw the conclusion like you did that we removed two countries that had been adversaries of Iran, the regimes, that's correct. But we did it for different reasons than to help Iran. That was not the motivation. That was the unintended consequence that Iran's geopolitical environment improved as a result of these U.S. actions. Iran cooperated with us in the removal of both to different degree. More with regard to the Taliban and less with regard to Iraq. I believe one of the issues is that in the case of Afghanistan, their increased influence is limited. In the case of Iraq, their increased influence is significant. Because in Afghanistan, the population is largely Sunni Muslim. The Shia minority is more in the central region, far away from the borders of Iran. And Afghans historically they have not looked towards Iran with favor. They have looked to Turkey, for example, historically Afghans more favorably, and have had historic ties with Turkey. In the case of Iraq, it's much more divided, and maybe there was an underappreciation of the complexities unintended. One of which is that the Shia Iraqis who are Arab on ethnicity-wise, but are religiously Shia, and many of the groups that oppose Saddam, Shia groups, came under the influence of Iran because Saddam was very draconian in dealing with them, and they took refuge in Iran. And the Sunnis, who were dominant Arabs, they're divided, but some favorable to Turkey with strong ties to Turkey, some to other neighbors. And the Kurds have had good ties with us, and they had difficult ties with Turkey, which has improved over time. Now their relationship with Turkey is quite positive. And so Iraq has become, especially after our departure in 2011, a geopolitical battlefield, if you like, for preeminence among the regional players. And they're playing their rivalry in the sectarian and ethnic and, if you like, table, where Iran is supporting the Shias and Shia militias. Turkey wants to check the Iranian influence and is cooperating with some Kurds and some Sunnis, and the Sunni Arab states also are supporting various groups. So the future of Iraq is really very much tied to the struggle for the future of this region. And so long as we were dominant there, we checked some of these tendencies. Once we left, that became the force, and it tore Iraq apart. And that fight now has spread to Syria, and in my judgment will continue for the foreseeable future.
You're aware that in the current political campaign, Donald Trump has accused President Obama of founding ISIS. He stands by that word, but the meaning, I suspect, that he's saying is that by the decision to withdraw perhaps precipitously from Iraq, that it encouraged the formation of ISIS. Is there truth to that?
Well, I would take exception to the word founding, but there is, on the other hand, no question that the vacuum created by our departure resulted in an intensified struggle both inside Iraq and more broadly. And in that intensified power struggle inside Iraq, the Shia-led government of Prime Minister Maliki, fearing a possible coup by officers of his own armed forces that were professionally trained by our people, he removed them and put political loyalists in charge who were party hacks, sort of, and at the same time, he became more sectarian than he was before, fearing Sunnis, especially as Syria began to unravel with the Sunnis leading the opposition to Bashar. And in that interaction, the successes that we had had previously through the surge and through increased political engagement to bring the Sunnis, Arabs, into the political process and to defeat the antecedent of ISIS, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Mr. Zarqawi being the head of that group that we killed, once the Sunni situation began to deteriorate, they felt marginalized and oppressed, and extreme circumstances came about. An extremist group like ISIS, which is really the son of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, found a base. So you could attribute that the decision to withdraw completely helped create circumstances that was conducive to the rise of ISIS.
Let me just ask a few questions before we move to questions from the audience. Looking ahead, perhaps optimistically or more realistically, what do you see as the future for both Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I say there are contingent futures. You could see alternative futures for them depending on what you assume with regard to 2 or 3 variables that are critical. One is our role, despite the fact of some significant retrenchment that has taken place on our part, we still have a critical role to play. We are an important factor. If we withdraw from Afghanistan, as some say we should, that would change the balance in favor of the opposition to the current government, which is largely Taliban and backed by Pakistan. And they would become, and perhaps over time, especially if the Afghan armed forces, which is the second key variable, and the Afghan anti-Taliban forces don't hold together, they collapse, especially if we also cut off, not only we withdraw, but cut off assistance too. Remember, that's what happened ultimately in Vietnam. When we cut off assistance to the regime, it collapsed. When the Soviets cut off assistance to the Najib, the communist government, and at the end of the 1980s or early 90s in Afghanistan, the regime collapsed. So if we do a combination of withdrawal of and cut off of assistance, it's possible that the regime armed forces could disintegrate and collapse. And then you go back perhaps to the 1990s Afghanistan and that environment in which you would have a civil war in which based on ethnicity and what different regional players, who they are supporting, Iran could become a bigger factor by supporting the anti-Taliban forces. What Russia does, what China does, will become factors. India has become a more important factor. So you could, but then you could actually say if we stayed And there was, we managed to convince Pakistan to bring the Taliban to a negotiating table, to have a power sharing arrangement, part of which could be a timetable for us to withdraw. That could be more, one possible outcome. So you could do several permutations depending on what you assume about the key factors being regional, internal, and our role. Similarly, in Iraq, I think it just depends on the factors. Again, the three factors: internal, is there an agreement among the three big components in Iraq of Shia, Sunni, Arabs, and Kurds about some formula power sharing, whether at the center or through decentralization, confederation, or federalism, that they feel satisfied, and then there is an understanding among the key regional powers about some rules with regard to how to deal with Iraq? Or is it that now we have got more than 5,000 troops almost there again, and no one talks about why don't we have a status of forces agreement? The administration says we left because there was no status of forces agreement, but we don't have one now. So you could see several permutations. I tend to be a little more pessimistic about Iraq than Afghanistan in the current circumstances, because Afghanistan is the beneficiary of the problems of Iraq, because our withdrawal led to the rise of ISIS and to the vacuum that was created. I think an American president would be reluctant to do the same thing again, given what we saw in Iraq. So I think the prospect that we will get out altogether is not high there, unless there is an agreement which stipulates that foreign forces should leave within 18 months after the peace agreement. So that's how I would assess it.
Well, I've committed a grievous error that I warned of, namely that this has been such a fascinating discussion that time is evaporating, but there is a chance for a question or two from the audience. And the question here is, are there any parallels to be seen between the rise of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in the 1980s and ISIS as a function of U.S. policy?
Well, we have to say that we tend to self-flagellate a little more than necessary. We make mistakes, but to blame the rise of Al-Qaeda on the United States, I think would be a mistake. I wouldn't agree with that in any case, because we went to Afghanistan in response to an attack by Al-Qaeda. And I believe that there is a crisis of Islamic civilization, that one part of the response is an extremist response to this crisis, and an element of the extremist response is a terroristic or terrorist, and that in certain circumstances that threat grows, where there are local grievances, where some people live in extreme circumstances, and those territories are ungoverned territories. That's sort of where terrorism and extremism grows. And it also grows when there is a state sponsor, a state supporting it. And often we don't talk about it because it's not good to talk in polite company about which states are supporting which terrorist group, but there is a state support dimension. You know, we regard the Haqqani network in Afghanistan as a terrorist group. It's on our list, but our chairman of Joint Chiefs said that group was a virtual arm of the Pakistani military intelligence. For example, we call some groups terrorists that we know Iran is supporting, and there are other groups. So there is those are the factors. But our departure in Iraq did contribute to create the circumstances in which ISIS grew. But the roots of ISIS has been there. The roots of Al-Qaeda has been there in this crisis that I talked about, and the factors that I mentioned that are conducive.
Thank you. Another question. Having served as ambassador to Iraq and Afghanistan, which of the two countries do you believe has a better long-term outlook for sustained democracy and political stability?
Well, it will take a long time, but Iraq has more resources, oil, for example. Iraq has a higher level of social and economic development because of those resources. Iraq's challenge is kind of the nation building. It's been a strong state, but not a strong nation, so to speak. This sense of belonging. At one time, there was the idea of Arab nationalism, Nasserism, Baathism, those of you who know the Middle East. But now you've got these smaller identities that have become very potent and powerful, overwhelming the bigger identities. So the Iraq's prospect depends on whether they can become a nation. Afghanistan is a nation. Afghans have had many opportunities to go their separate ways. The Uzbek Afghans, for example, could have declared independence. General Dostum, who controlled the territory, had his own air force, currency, but said, no, the fight is about Afghanistan, not about separation. But it's a weak state. State institutions have been destroyed, and we have been building, trying to build institutions. We just didn't know how long it would take, how expensive it would be, and how terrible the circumstances were when we found ourselves there. I myself should have known better, given my own background. I was shocked by the set of circumstances when the president asked me in January of 2002 to go to Afghanistan to visit, as his envoy before I became ambassador. So, so therefore, on nationhood, better prospect for Afghanistan, on the state bill, on poorer record for Iraq. But I would think that, we have to remember that we're dealing with a region in crisis, but other regions that have had similar crises or even worse have managed to overcome them over time. And we can learn lessons from that, although each region is unique. Imagine Europe in different phases of its history, the 30-year war, the kind of First World War, Second World War, or you think of Asian balance changes over time in aftermath of Vietnam. The dominoes, the fear of what would Southeast Asia be like, and then in both, through a lot of difficulties, they overcame to their history, to move, to make progress towards normalcy. We played a role, an important role. So while this region looks overwhelmingly negative right now, but perhaps it may have to get worse before they also come to some arrangement, the regional powers, for some rules of the game for their own future. And if who can predict how long it will take to get to that? But if it does, then the situation will look promising for the region.
Thank you. Is there a tendency not to act on intelligence because we don't like or want to believe what the intelligence is telling us, either over-optimism or denial?
Sure. I mean, I have to say now I've served long enough in government in many different roles to that intelligence can be wrong. If we look at, we were surprised by the speed of Soviet acquisition of nuclear weapons. We were surprised by the Soviet acquisition, the speed of Soviet acquisition of hydrogen bomb. We were surprised by the Indian nuclear tests, which these are physical stuff. We were underestimated Saddam's progress on nuclear capability when we went to the Gulf War. we were wrong by our assumption about the WMD capability when we went to the war subsequently after 9/11. So intelligence can be wrong, can be right. I'm sure some decision makers do not like negative intelligence, if you like, that its policies is not producing the results that you want. But also there is a tendency, perhaps on the part of people in intelligence, it's human nature. It's always nice to be surprised positively that they tell you things are much harder and you turn out to be doing better than you say things are rosy and you tend it looks much worse. It becomes worse. So there is this ability to protect your reputation and you know, to be more negative generally. I have heard that among our policy types. But I think we have a good intelligence organization. They need to be reformed like all other organizations to adapt, to change. We're good at technical stuff relatively, based on my experience. You know, talking about the human condition and how humans will behave under different circumstances. That's there our record is less good. On technical issue, we've also have had problems like the nuclear issues that I mentioned. So, you know, as Secretary Rumsfeld would say, you work with the intelligence that you have, not the intelligence you wish you had. So, but that's part of the reality of the circumstances.
In this year's political debate, first Senator Cruz of Texas and now Donald Trump have accused first President Obama, then Hillary Clinton, of not using the phrase radical Islamic terrorism, and making the political point that by not using that phrase that they are hiding from the problem. Can you help us understand, especially as a prominent Muslim American, what is freighted with words like that?
I don't know why we're not saying that myself. I mean, there is as I said, in response to the crises, there is a response in the Islamic world, which is extreme to the crisis and as a terrorist dimension. So when I write, I do mention it, Islamic extremism and the terror. So I have no personally an issue, but I also don't know whether Mr. Trump is right to say if you don't use this word, you're running away from the problem, so to speak. So I don't understand that either myself. The fact is that the issue of terrorism from the Muslim majority part of the world is one of the most serious national security challenges that we face. And the response, in my view, as the right, is to protect ourselves, harden ourselves against it, and to go after those that wish us harm, but not to get dragged into the civil war within Islam or into that region, because that will zap our energies. We will get entangled in a problem for which we don't have the solution, and it really isn't, you know, we can't solve it. So, and we ought to help those who have a vision for the future that is more inclusive and that embraces Shia and Sunnis accept each other as equally good Muslims and have a humane, worldly, positive vision for themselves. But to be very careful not to get entangled into these kind of tribal warfare, kind of along sectarian and other lines, because great powers can overextend themselves and zap their energies by believing they can solve everything and they can, and you have the capabilities, so the temptation to get involved may be there. But I would be very, very careful about that. But I have no issue calling it as Islamic extremism or Islamic terror. But I also, as I said before, do not think. I think that's a rhetorical point that is being made by Mr. Trump. I don't think that makes a huge difference. We don't want to appear, and I made that point to him when I spoke with him, when I was introducing him, when he gave his foreign policy speech, that it wouldn't be smart for America, leaving aside my own identity or background, that he would say things in a way that insults or denigrates all Muslims. That would be a strategic mistake, besides being wrong in itself. From an American national interest point of view, that would be a strategic mistake. There is a 1.6, 1.5 billion people who are of that faith. And if you inadvertently, or especially, I don't think anyone knowingly would want to do that, but inadvertently, that the way you talk unites them all against us, so to speak, that wouldn't be very smart. So even if you don't like them for whatever reasons, on ecclesiastical grounds, on whatever, but as president, you're going to have a national security responsibility. It's not wouldn't be a very smart thing to insult an entire religion of 1.6 billion people, or any religion. So I made that point to him myself. But as I also insisted that he could not insult President Bush by saying that he lied to the American people, because I told him that I was there when intelligence was arriving as his assistant, and there was overwhelming intelligence given to him that Saddam Hussein had chemical and biological weapons. Nuclear was a separate issue. So that you may criticize someone on decisions that he made, but whether he should have invaded even in the face of that intelligence, and whether he should have invaded it the way he did, we should have done what we did afterward, those are legitimate issues. But to accuse President Bush of lying was, I thought, a mistake and wrong, and therefore I would not introduce him if he was to insist on that.
The last question I have from the card here is on that historical subject. The member says, an open letter was addressed to President Clinton years before 9/11, urging him to remove Saddam Hussein from power due to weapons of mass destruction. The letter was signed by Donald Rumsfeld, among others, among others who served in Bush's administration. They had the mindset to invade Iraq well before 9/11, which they used as an excuse to invade. Your commentary, please.
Sure. That letter did not call on the Clinton administration to invade Iraq. I was in the Pentagon when we did the Gulf War. As I told you, I was in charge of policy planning. And many of us had a bad taste in our mouth in the aftermath of that war, although it was hugely successful from a pure military point of view. We liberated Kuwait in a relatively short order, very effectively. It had psychological positive effect. We had beaten the Vietnam syndrome, where people assumed we wouldn't do big things militarily in the aftermath of that. But on the other hand, we left Saddam in place, which was part of the objective of the war was not to overthrow him. But then we imposed very draconian sanctions on Iraqis, sanctions that really very negatively affected the lives of many Iraqis. We left them, although we called on them during the war to rise up more against the dictator. And then at the end, we left them with Saddam and with sanctions. So we felt, myself included, some ambivalence about the set of circumstances that we had left the Iraqis in. And then many thought that given this unpleasant set of circumstances, that perhaps we ought to help the help Iraqis liberate themselves from Saddam, because he was highly unpopular with the Shia and with the Kurds. We knew that fact because we protected the Kurds in the aftermath of that war when Saddam turned his war machine against the Kurds. President Bush Sr. Declared a no-fly zone and a line in the sand that the Iraqis could not cross into Iraqi forces into Kurdistan region of Iraq. And we had known from Shia, were the majority population of Iraq, that they were very unhappy with Saddam. So it was, how do we follow policy to empower the people to rise up and overthrow him? And Congress had passed a law before the letter, or maybe after the letter, but I think before the letter, calling it the Iraq Liberation Act, where it said some of our military access equipment should be given to Iraqis fighting Saddam Hussein so that they would have a better chance of overthrowing him. I do not believe that we would have invaded Iraq, and I was in the administration from day one, as I told you, the Bush administration, and I was in charge of reviewing our Iraq strategy. I was actually guiding this assessment for the president, and there was no one, and I mean no one, including people that are generally named like Secretary Ramsey, who was advocating an invasion before 9/11. The idea was, how do we change the sanctions regime? Secretary Powell had the idea of smart sanctions, focused on a few things, but more convergence or agreement among nations. Secretary Rumsfeld wanted to do the no-fly zone differently. Paul Wolfowitz wanted to help the opposition more with assistance. 9/11 changed the equation that someone made the case that the president found compelling, and it would include the British Prime Minister, that, look, we left Afghanistan percolate with the crises. We know Al-Qaeda was there, but we occasionally struck, and look what happened. This is an unsettled situation. It's percolating. The guy, Saddam, is a threat. He's acquiring WMD. He already has some. He's building others. Let's not repeat the mistake of Afghanistan to face something from Iraq. And I think that changed the balance. There was no pre-cooked, if somebody finds it, I would be very impressed, plan that in the 90s the decision was by some people made that let's go invade, and they were waiting to win the elections to go invade Iraq. No. Although there were some mistakes made in my view, and the book is full of them, of how we did it, why we should, should have we done it the time we did it, should we have made more progress in Afghanistan before doing it, doing two big nation buildings at the same time, was this wise? The tactics of dissolving the Iraqi army, was that the right thing to do or not? Those are legitimate debates in my view that you could take the administration to task, but I think this was a pre-cooked plan in that letter. I think is not right.
Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, thank you very much for honoring us with your presence and a very exciting discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.